Greetings, everyone. Very nice to meet you. Thank you for coming to the conference today. I flew here from New York, which is a long journey. But over the years, I've learned that when Tsuneo Nishida makes a request, that I have to always agree. Nishida-san is not only a very learned man, now a professor, but I know him as a world-class diplomat. I interact with many representatives of foreign ministries. It is rare that I've had the chance to meet somebody with the intelligence and the humanity and the leadership that Nishida-san shows. So I'm very honored to be here at your invitation and at Hiroshima University. Thank you very much. I think the only Japanese official that I met previous to you 25 years ago is Madame Sadaka Ogata. She and I first met in 1992 at the London conference on the former Yugoslavia. She played such an important role as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And at the London Peace Conference, we were discussing how to arrange the return of refugees in Bosnia who were victims of ethnic cleansing. She is a person of great principle, great talent. At the time, we felt overwhelmed with the global refugee crisis. But the crisis that existed then, though large and significant, is much less than the global refugee crisis that we face today. The problems that we face today need a more coherent response from the international community. There are about 65 million people around the world who are displaced by violent conflict or by persecution. There are another 15 to 20 million who are displaced by natural disasters and by the implications of climate change. Of those that are displaced, about 20 million are refugees. This means that they have crossed an international border, and having done so, they are subject to the protections of international humanitarian law. The rest are called internally displaced persons, or IDPs. Because they are displaced within their own country, they're not subject to the same levels of protection. And oftentimes it's the government of the country where they reside who is responsible for the conflict that displaced them in the first place. So these IDPs that have not crossed an international border face a very big challenge. We are all challenged by the size and the scope of this global refugee crisis. The international system, as well as donor countries like Japan, are overwhelmed trying to meet the needs of refugees, IDPs, and also migrants. Migrants are a new category of displaced person. We hear a lot about them in the context of the European exodus and flight of peoples. Migrants are those who have left their home country seeking greater economic opportunity. So they may not be the direct victims of a conflict, but they are also in need of sanctuary. The conditions for those displaced are getting worse. More than a dozen conflicts have broken out in the past 6 years only. The primary producers of displaced people are Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Somalia, the Central African Republic. But the list goes on. There are other countries that are also producing displaced people as well. Since I have the opportunity to work directly on the Syria and Iraq crises, I'm going to reflect with you today some of the experience and lessons learned from those conflicts. I'm also going to reflect the response of the international community, including my own country, the United States. Our discussion will start with an assessment of the architecture that allocates responsibility for those displaced by conflict and for other reasons. The United Nations has the primary mandate to address the refugee and IDP issues. And the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is the primary international official taking the lead on these matters. Given the importance of displacement to world affairs, it's not surprising that the new UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, was until recently the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. The UN going forward will face many crises, including the crisis of displacement. And Mr. Guterres, because of his experience, his skill, and his temperament, is extremely well placed to play a leading role as the Secretary General of the world body. In addition to the UNHCR, there are other groups like the International Organization for Migration, a related UN organization, which has a specific role to support governments and non-governmental organizations working on displacement issues. The responsibility for those displaced often falls to individual countries or to regional bodies. In the case of the Syria crisis, the European Union has been struggling to find a coherent response. Among the member states, there is a big difference in the approach. We also see a dramatic difference in how individual member states have responded. Germany welcomed more than 1 million Syrian refugees, whereas other countries, such as Slovakia or Hungary, have rejected them. We also see how the frontline states, Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, have a particularly large burden. The UNHCR, in response to this crisis, has been expanding its responsibilities. It's assumed a leading role for the protection of IDPs, adding them to what's called the Global Protection Cluster, alongside its work protecting refugees. Development agencies and the UN Peacebuilding Commission and the Support Office also are playing an important role to help states build their capacity for work in this field, and also to create conditions mitigating humanitarian emergencies before they occur. I want to emphasize here that the sanctuary and services provided to refugees needs to go hand in hand with a conflict prevention strategy. Because the way to deal with a refugee crisis is to prevent violent conflict before it arises, and then to break the cycle of violence so that those displaced can return to their home. Now, when we look at the scale of the crisis, there are very big challenges, both operationally and financially, to the international system. The UN Consolidated Appeal Process sought $20 billion from donor countries in 2015. Japan is a generous donor to the Consolidated Appeal Process. But even with the generosity of Japan and contributions from other countries as well, Norway, though a small country, punches above its weight in providing assistance. Only $11 billion was raised. So just a little more than half of the needs to provide for refugees was met financially. That's because donors have a sense of exhaustion. Refugee crises are ongoing. I talked about the Bosnian crisis of 1992. If you are a donor country, it seems that year after year there's more crisis, there are greater and greater demands, and the ability of the industrialized, wealthier countries to meet those needs is less and less. It's important that we not only provide more aid, but that we also provide what we'll call better aid. Better aid can be achieved through innovation in the humanitarian space. And today I'm going to focus my remarks with some specific recommendations about how the international system can function more effectively. It can do that by bridging the gap between humanitarian and development activities, mitigating the impact of climate change on displacement, emphasizing conflict prevention to address the root causes of displacement. So I'm going to elaborate for you now some ideas in these three baskets of activity. Humanitarian aid and development assistance should not be in different silos. They should be thought of conceptually together. This year, 2016, marks the official launch of the Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals, which are to be achieved over the next 15 years. These are called SDGs, and they inherited the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals that have been in place over the past decade. The new agenda calls on countries to achieve 17 SDGs. It offers 169 target goals to be accomplished over this 15-year period. And when you look at the SDGs, only 2 of the target objectives, which number 169, refer to migrants. And none of the targets even make mention of the term refugees. To more effectively manage today's refugee and migrant crisis, UN action should be addressed through the prism of the SDGs. By implementing the SDGs, we'll strengthen the resilience factor in humanitarian programming and deal with some of the core questions that create displacement in the first place, and help contribute to conditions so that those displaced will be able to go home. Now, of the 17 SDGs, let me identify those that are relevant to the refugee and migrant issues. SDG 1 addresses poverty. 2 addresses hunger. SDG 5 refers to gender equality. SDG 8 concerns work conditions and economic growth. 10 deals with inequalities. 13 addresses global warming and climate conditions. And SDG number 16 refers to peace, justice, and the development of strong institutions. It's important to take these SDGs and adapt them to the requirements of the global refugee crisis. The displaced need durable solutions linking humanitarian aid and economic development. When you're displaced, it's not something that exists for a month or 2. The average years for IDPs to be displaced is 23. And refugees are displaced for an average of 17 years. Once you're displaced, it's hard to go home. In 2014, only 1% of refugees were resettled to their original countries of residence. That's why it's important to think about SDGs to enhance stability and promote long-term development in failed and fragile states. These are the states that produce displacement. and which would benefit most from institution building and capacity building in order to eliminate the conditions that gave rise to displacement in the first place. So being practical and proactive, as Professor Nishida knows me to be, I'm going to make some specific recommendations here. I suggest that the new UN Secretary General lead an initiative with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees as a focal point and involving IOM to assess and plan what I'll refer to as the UN's whole-of-system approach. The initiative would adapt SGDs to refugee needs so that they are implemented and mainstreamed through all of the UN's projects, policies, funding, and the development of indicators. And I want you to know that in addition to sharing this recommendation with you here today, I've also shared it directly with the new UN Secretary General, who is an extremely capable and committed individual. I believe that the world body is in very good hands, and I believe Mr. Guterres will address these crises forthrightly. The second thematic area of recommendation concerns the issue of climate change. Did everybody notice the beautiful weather that we're having here today? We were talking earlier about the skiing conditions in Japan, that many of the winter resorts are facing economic difficulties because there's simply no snow on the slopes. Well, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, otherwise known as the Paris Agreement, seeks to combat climate change and to adapt the international community to its effects. It was adopted by 195 countries and so far ratified by 114 countries, enough for the convention to go into effect. We have to be steely-eyed in assessing the impact of climate change. Climate change contributes to famines and droughts. It's increasingly the driver of conflict and displacement, particularly in conflict-prone areas in sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and also of South Asia. It's a rather shocking figure, but it's estimated that as many as 200 million people may be displaced as a result of climate change by the year 2050. Building on the Paris Agreement, which in and of itself was a great breakthrough, and I applaud President Obama for his leadership in this area of work, the UN needs to lead an effort to prepare for the impacts of climate change on displacement. The agreement calls for the creation of a climate displacement task force to recommend measures, quote, to avert, minimize, and address displacement related to the adverse effects of climate change. Now, it's good to make a declaration, it's good to pronounce a goal, and collecting and sharing knowledge is a good start. However, findings must be quickly translated into action items. It may be my own cultural orientation, my background as an American, but I'm always asking, what can we do in order to solve the problem? Studying it is not enough. So I'm recommending that the UN Secretary General lead an effort to engage national and local governments, as well as civil society, in the development of regional plans on how to deal with the displacement risks and hazards, floods, storms, droughts, sea level rising, the vulnerabilities of different communities. Some will be particularly vulnerable, more vulnerable than others, and then the resilience in affected communities. These recommendations would focus on the UN capacities and recommend specific action that the UN departments and different UN agencies can take to mitigate the impact of climate change on displacement. The third area for my recommendations deal with conflict prevention and peace building. Clearly more needs to be done to prevent conflicts before they start if we want to deal with this enormous spiral of the refugee population. We have to prevent violent conflict at its source. In order to do that, we need to conceptualize conflict prevention not as a piecemeal effort where there are occasional negotiations, typically led by the UN Department of Political Affairs, but as a whole, conceptualize the elements that go into national capacity building that can help prevent conflicts. This deals with security and justice reform, the promotion of the rule of law. It strengthens local governance, as well as public administration. Economic development and job creation is another essential tool for preventing conflicts. So is our government systems. I believe that in a democratic system, people become stakeholders, and they are less likely to seek redress through violence if they know that their votes matter and that they can achieve a regime change at the ballot box, not necessarily through violence. And of course, dialogue is important. I know in my own family, when there are differences of opinion, sometimes you want to shout at one another, but oftentimes you sit down, you talk things through, you develop a better mutual understanding, and you try to act in ways that are consistent with the interests of everyone in the family. I have twin daughters who are 12 years old. I always try to emphasize for them the importance of dialogue. I tell them that yelling and screaming won't achieve your objectives. Convincing me, your father, that your interests are reasonable is the best way. So dialogue is key. Now the UN system and UN agencies have vast experience. The United Nations Development Program works on conflict prevention and peace building. There are UNDP offices. Usually the UNDP person is the head of a mission, and a UN country team that involves other UN agencies like UNICEF or UNFPA. It's important that all these agencies work together in tandem. It's also important that specialized departments of the UN system operate more effectively. There was established some years ago the Peace Building Commission and the Peace Building Support Office. Now, frankly speaking, these bodies are pretty moribund. They spend some money, they employ a lot of people, they don't have a big impact. But they can have a significantly greater impact, and these bodies can be revitalized if they have a more relevant mandate and more proactive leadership. And the mandate that I'm recommending deals specifically with the conflict prevention program. I suggest and propose that the UN Peacebuilding Commission create a working group on displacement. This working group would be responsible for coordinating and operationalizing what's called the interoperability of the different parts of the UN system. It would develop integrated strategies for post-conflict peace building and recovery. It would consider the needs of individual countries that are affected by displacement and focus on reconstruction and institution building efforts in order to stabilize countries so that displacement stops and people can go home. So I'm sure you all have been following the tragic news of developments in Aleppo. Aleppo is Syria's second largest city. It's been divided between government control and rebel controlled areas. And over the past 4 weeks, as a result of a constant bombardment with barrel bombs and sophisticated weapons, 300,000 civilians in eastern Aleppo have been put at risk. Targeting hospitals, schools, killing civilians is a war crime. I'm going to exceed the time that you've allocated to me. I just got a flash and I have 5 minutes left, but I don't want to shortchange you. So we need to do something about Aleppo. It's not a humanitarian crisis only. It's not about humanitarian corridors. It's about a peace settlement for Syria. We all know what Syria is going to look like at the end of this war. It will have 3 regions. Those regions will be divided between Alawites in Damascus and up to Latakia. The northern area will be led by Syrian Kurds. Sunni Arabs, which are the majority, will predominate in the other region of the country. We just need a way of getting from where we are now to where the war stops. And that can't happen unless the UN isn't providing motivated leadership. And it can't happen unless the United States is more deeply involved. So I hope that the United States can work effectively with Russia and other international stakeholders towards a final agreement on the Syrian civil war. It's high time. Almost 500,000 people have been killed in the past 5 years. More than 11 million have been displaced. This is half of Syria's population. And we see that the flight of Syrians has created regional instability. Turkey has 2.7 million refugees. Lebanon has 20% of Lebanon's population are Syrian refugees. And there are 660,000 Syrians that have been registered in Jordan. There probably are many more that are there. So their presence has destabilized those governments as well. It's usually the frontline states that bear the largest burden, the greatest responsibility. And they often are those countries that have inadequate means and capacity to deal with the problem. So let's talk now about sanctuary. Everybody wants to go to Europe. Initially, Sweden and Germany rolled out a welcome mat, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the enormity of the problem. The European Union tried to manage a coherent response, but it's been unable to do that. Now, it's easy to lay blame elsewhere, but I also want to reflect on the response by the United States. My great-grandparents came to New York as refugees from Minsk in Ukraine in 1898. And I remember hearing the story of their arrival in New York and reading the inscription on the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Now, I'm so proud of this inscription because it says so much about America's character, wanting to help others, to do that selflessly. The United States is entirely a country of those displaced, of those who came there under difficult circumstances. When we look at the U.S. response to the Syrian refugee crisis, it is a source of deep embarrassment to me. Only 10,000 Syrians have been resettled in the United States to date. In 2015, only 85,000 people from around the world were resettled. After 9/11, there's a deep and well-founded concern about security. Anyone who comes has to be carefully vetted and screened. And this issue has become hotly debated in the United States. It was also a topic that was very prevalent in our recent presidential election. The tenor of the debate is something that I disapprove of strongly. Somehow people that wanted to come to the United States and find protection and safety there were impugned as potential sources of risk. During the campaign, President-elect Donald Trump raised questions about the character and intention of refugees looking to come to the United States. He said, "We don't know who they are. They have no documentation. We don't know what they're planning. He called them a Trojan horse for the Islamic State. Well, he might as well have been referring to my great-grandmother and grandfather, who came with no paperwork, and who resettled, built a business, and became pillars of the community in New York. Trump's criticism of the displaced seeking sanctuary doesn't stop with those words. He's recommended specific policies. No, I will not finish my presentation. Thank you for the message there. Trump has proposed measures to halt all Syrian refugees coming to the United States. He's recommended that we suspend immigration from countries and regions that are, quote, compromised by terrorism. He's recommended extreme vetting, including ideological certification, showing that refugees share American values. He's demanded congressional approval to reduce the number of legal immigrants from the current level, which is already much too low. Proposed tightening security across the immigration system, including families seeking reunification. And you know, he's proposed that we build a wall between the United States and Mexico in order to prevent illegal migrants from coming in. I bet that half of the people working in his hotels and his golf courses are Mexicans who have come into the country illegally, looking for a better life, not unlike my great-grandparents did. Instead of providing services, we're proposing to build more centers to detain those arrested. And we've also suggested that cities like New York, where I come from, that act on their own to provide sanctuary to refugees would somehow be punished, that they'd be denied funds from the federal government for basic activities. So I'm hoping that what was said in the campaign and what will be implemented during the administration are different approaches. I believe that American values are strongly rooted in humanitarianism. And that humanitarianism isn't just a program or a policy. It's based on a set of beliefs. When one person suffers, we all suffer. The homeless child could be our child. That screaming girl in Aleppo could be my daughter. So we need to safeguard and provide security, but we also, not only the United States, but all countries, have to be agents for healing and help. Now more than ever, with the enormous demand of humanity, we must answer the call with kindness and compassion and by offering sanctuary. So I'm very grateful for the chance to share these views with you. You can see that my approach is both principled but practical, and we need to affect policies not only in the United States but in the international community so that we can all work more closely together to address what is a problem that we all share. So thank you all very much.